Good to see everyone again. This next panel is called The New Era of Reindustrialization, and joining us we have four individuals who have been massively influential forces, whether as investors or operators or advocates in bringing manufacturing back to American and allied shores. Would love to introduce each of you. Christian Garrett is an investment partner at 137 Ventures, a growth stage venture capital firm with over $6 billion in assets under management. He is also a fellow conference organizer, co-founder of the Hill and Valley Forum, which is one of the largest bipartisan gatherings of technology and government leaders in the country, which has hosted Vice President JD Vance, cabinet secretaries, senators from both parties, and technology leaders, including Peter Thiel, Jensen Huang, and Alex Karp. He earned his bachelor's from the University of Kansas, where he played Division I basketball, won 4 Big 12 championships, and went to the Final Four in 2012. Pete Mathias is a general partner at Reveal VC, a venture capital firm backing founders building critical technologies in energy, security, and productivity. Pete holds an MBA from Dartmouth Tuck School, an MPA from Harvard Kennedy School, a master's with distinction from Oxford, and a BA magna cum laude from Dartmouth. He is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and a drummer for indie rock band Fil. Austin Bishop is an investor, entrepreneur, and national leader on reindustrialization. He was the founding CEO. No? Well, he was the founding CEO. Oh, AI is cooked, guys. He was the founding CEO and now chairman. This wasn't even AI, by the way. This is from the NIC website. But he was the founding CEO and now chairman of the New American Industrial Alliance and was head and a co-founder of the Reindustrialize Summit. Previously, Austin was head of U.S. trading at the hedge fund Marshall Wace and co-founder of the advanced manufacturing company Atomic Industries. A native of Cleveland, he is a leading voice for rebuilding America's industrial strengths. Austin leads origination at the new industrial company, sourcing and managing new partnerships with founders, capital, and aligned institutions. And finally, Fil Aronshtein, who just arrived from Union Station. We made it in the nick of time. Fil is co-founder and CEO of Dirac, advancing American manufacturing through AI-driven production orchestration. Dirac's flagship product, Build OS, automatically generates precise assembly work instructions directly from CAD files, enabling companies to rapidly transition from design to production and have dynamic and adaptive factories. Sorry, the handwriting is a little small here. Prior to founding Dirac in 2022, Fil worked as a hardware engineer at Northrop Grumman and taught quantum software development at MIT Lincoln Laboratory. He holds a BS in electrical engineering and an MS in robotics from Johns Hopkins University. Thank you all so much for being here. To start off, I think it'd be great to hear a little bit more about what got each of you involved in the mission of reindustrializing the country.
I can start us off. So as you mentioned, my bachelor's in electrical engineering and master's in robotics took me over to Northrop Grumman, where I started off doing a little bit of a pretty cool radar work over there. When they ran out of electrical engineering work to give me, they gave me some mechanical engineering work to do. And then when they ran out of mechanical engineering work to give me, they gave me some technician work. So I got to do a little bit of assembly and a little bit of test and just got to see how ridiculously archaic all of the infrastructure was on the manufacturing side of things. What to me seemed like a pretty advanced company on the engineering side. And just wanted to do something about it. I was starting to get the feeling that the West was forgetting how to build great things, and I want to make sure that did not happen. So here we are.
Love it. I'm up next. I grew up in the Rust Belt, and Cleveland, used to be one of the richest cities, not only in the country, but in the entire world. Long before I was born. But even in the 60s and 70s, there were still hints of that, and really accelerating into the 90s when I was born. And as a kid, I just saw so many of these incredible businesses and leaders of industry who employed tons and tons of people, many of whom, my family members, as these companies shut down. And whether it was jobs getting sent overseas or whatever it was, it just left a massive impact on me as a kid. So I got out of Cleveland because it was hard to find good jobs there as someone with no work experience when I was young. Moved to New York, and I was in hedge funds for a long time, and just went down this broader rabbit hole that on weekends, just trying to understand what actually happened in the Rust Belt. Why did we move these jobs offshore? And without pointing any fingers, it kind of came back to me, this is 2018, 2017, that it seemed to me the decisions that were made over the last 3 decades that led us to move so many of these jobs overseas didn't make sense in the next 2-3 decades for many different reasons. Geopolitical, where there were massive breakthroughs in technology and automation in the last few years, And so I, quit a pretty cushy gig and decided I really want to take a big swing on betting on building and investing in companies that are focused on, whether it's making more stuff in the U.S. or just providing more sovereignty for the U.S. to have control over where and how things are produced, whether it's energy, supply chain, logistics, manufacturing. I will say this was very lonely in 2018 or 2019. I think we were a little early. And I do think without COVID and without the things that occurred during that time in the supply chain crisis, we were talking about this with Flexport in the back room. I'm not convinced that we would be where we are right now. That was a massive wake-up call, I think, for everyone. Is moms in the Midwest couldn't get baby formula because the Suez Canal was blocked. It's like, this sounds like an ad lib. And so, ever since then, been focused on this mission and really excited to see how much it's grown.
For the undergrads out there, hopefully what I am about to tell you gives you comfort. I, out of college, had a rock band. I was a drummer. And for 5 years, professional, we toured all over the country. So I've been to not only the big cities, but a lot of the very small ones. Easily 100,000 miles of over-the-road music. And I'm from Chicago. I guess that is Rust Belt. But with the band, I had a front row seat to the country, all of it. And maybe some of you have done cross-country road trips, with friends and things like that. But for sure, when you spend deep time all over the country, you realize that we've inherited a lot. That the people who came before us were very serious builders. And today, it's weird. We, 20% of our economy or something like that is built world, is physical things, and 80% of it is stuff on laptops, frankly I do. But that really is, I think, for me, foundational to why, as a venture investor, I care about resilience and industrialization. Is really, to whom much is given, much is expected. And we've been given a ton by virtue of those that came before. So it's a simple gesture of responsibility, perhaps.
Yeah, I would say for me, probably multifaceted. I think one, got a first row seat to learning a lot about these problems as an investor. Our firm has been 16-year investors in SpaceX, which is kind of one of the pioneers, not just from one of the first companies to prioritize selling to the government again from Silicon Valley, but particularly on the manufacturing side and solving hard problems here and building that culture that Elon has really led the way in with Tesla and SpaceX. To then obviously Palantir, Anduril, a bunch of these other companies that we've had the good fortune of being long-term partners with. And so I think there was the beginnings of firsthand seeing a lot of the problems that maybe were less popular or less in the public eye. Austin mentioned COVID was a huge accelerant. Ukraine also was. I think most people for a long time, we all have been talking about the fact that we would run out of munitions in a matter of weeks, months, or years, depending on the conflict. And Ukraine highlighted that, particularly with the Javelin systems. And so I think that was also another accelerant in the past couple of years. The other side was definitely COVID was a big piece there. I think really that started to highlight my sort of meta view, which was that if you're in a Cold War, and we've had one historically, what are the economic and national security decisions that were made then that we're not making now and that probably we will end up making? And so I think everything you're seeing now was seemingly fairly obvious a couple of years ago, and then there's been these accelerants that have definitely led the trend. And I think that is a safe assumption. We are in great power competition. What are the sort of obvious rational decisions that we've made in the past within that, and what are the ones that we'll make moving forward? And one of them has obviously been reindustrialization as a key part of it. Why prioritize it now so much? And I think a lot of the other sort of panelists here have been doing it a lot longer and I think more impactful than I have. But the little piece of why I do care deeply about this is because of the derivative impact. It's not national security only. The derivative impact is how can we get economic growth again in the West? How do you solve income inequality? There are all these things that really were downstream of deindustrializing, and I think they can happen again downstream if we reindustrialize well. And these are like high convexity problems, like income inequality is not getting solved, not getting better, particularly if we're not going to solve education, health, those other issues. But if we reindustrialize, we can create some economic growth and opportunity that didn't exist before. So I think that's the other exciting part, is you can have all these other things get solved potentially if you do this right outside of national security.
Yeah. Pete, you mentioned a particularly interesting comment there with we inherited a lot from the previous generations. And when it comes to this generation, and specifically the things that they choose to do with their career, should we be focused on bringing more people into, say, the trades or manufacturing, or is there also an angle where, say, call it the laptop class, can focus on these issues of manufacturing and industry via automation?
Well, when I look at a city like Detroit was not built by a process. I mean, here we are, we're talking industrialization, reindustrialization. That's a verb. Like, a verb actually is not what built Detroit. A noun is when that is the car. A product, a car, that is that creative ingenuity that resulted in Detroit. So I don't care if you're on a laptop or if you're in the trenches trying to build. What's most important is that we unleash a certain amount of creativity to come up with the products that will shape the next century. Because actually, if you think about it, there aren't that many products that we've created that have been truly, you talk about like the economic curve, that have actually really accelerated that. I mean, just think it in your head. Yeah, there's a smartphone most recently, perhaps chips, but after the airplane and the car, you're sort of grasping for like, well, what are like the big products that we've come up with that we now build. So for me, it's actually like, doesn't really matter how you do it, laptop or with tools in your hand. What matters is that we're somehow thinking big about products. That's kind of what Phil in the end like.
I mean,
so.
What we think about when we're looking at the current state of American manufacturing, right? We look at not just the most advanced companies out there, right? The SpaceXs, the Andurils. A lot of what we see is not just a hollowing out of the industrial base that ends up being the supply chain to those companies, but the companies that you were just sort of referencing, the companies that built Detroit, right? The GMs, the Fords. A lot of what gave those cities their way of life, that enabled them to put food on the table, that enabled them to change fundamentally how their quality of life operated. Those smaller companies, those mid-sized companies, even large enterprises today, what we've seen over the past like 20 years has been like I would call even like 30, 40, 50 years, has been a systematic decision that we've made as a country to decide not to invest in those types of jobs and those types of roles, because we thought the best way to increase quality of life for people was to turn into a sort of like service economy, right? And so when we think more about what reindustrialization means, at least how I think about it, how my team thinks about it, we think about it as an increase in the quality of life for the folks who are, all of our supply chain, all of our infrastructure rely on. So, yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about China, because I think fundamentally a lot of this discussion here is framed against China, right? And against Chinese production and Chinese manufacturing. And I think, a significant part of China's edge in manufacturing has been attributed, and I'm curious if you're to agree or disagree, to the work culture and just the setup of the labor there, right? Engineers living at the factory, working around the clock all week. We're not doing that, at least universally here in the United States. Does something need to change here? Is the solution somewhere else?
So I would hit on that. Definitely true that there's obviously a huge advantage. They work 100% much harder than many people at elite academic institutions like Georgetown maybe would want to. And that is definitely true. Obviously, there are parts of the country that's not true, right? I mean, we are a massive population set. But the thing that, like, I for a long time believed that there's just certain things we will never be able to build here And a lot of it is like a cost analysis, and some of that is just driven by the labor pool that they have against ours. But like, has anyone read, maybe most people here, if you haven't, but you should read Patrick McGree's book, Apple in China. The thing that I didn't really appreciate was like, Apple spent inflation-adjusted 2 Marshall Plans in China, building out the supply chain, over $250 billion. And it turns out they got an incredible return for that. Had Apple spent $250 billion domestically building out that supply chain, would the unit economics have been as great on the iPhone? Maybe not, but you would damn near have real capacity. So I do think it's like a little bit of a lie that we can't do these things, particularly because if you just look at the scale of investment that was in China over time, then you can see that we can at least get some return on this. I will say there's a lot of barriers that we have to, even if you deploy that money, right, from regulatory, environmental, things like that, absolutely, but you would definitely get a return. And on your point, like, you have to decide as a country that you want to be an industrial powerhouse. Like, what China has done so well outside of the labor stuff is just plain old mercantilism. And the US used to do that. Like, we used to do this very well. The Industrial Revolution was not invented here, right? It was invented across the Atlantic. We just ended up being able to implement it and scale it much better. And you see a similar dynamic in China, but it's because the country decided they want to be an industrial powerhouse. Japan did this, Europe did this. Like, this is not new. And I think as a country, if we decide that we want to be an industrial powerhouse, it turns out every single major superpower sustains that power because they have manufacturing capacity, then we'll be in a good spot. And right now we look a little bit more like Germany than we do like America in World War II, where we make exquisite systems, but we cannot produce mass. And I think we want to flip that equation.
So I have lived and been an investor in Germany, in China, and obviously here in the US. And so I'll give a caricature of what we just heard. This is a caricature, but truth in comedy. I mean, this is informed by lived experience. So if you go up to a German corporate executive, and you go to the German corporate executive, hey, I've got an idea. I want to try it. They'll say, why? Why would we do that? By the way, I know that because I pitched that German executive. If you go to an American executive, hey, I got an idea, I want to give it a shot. American executive is going to say to you, why not? They'll say, sort of, show me the budget, show me what you have in mind, and we'll give it a shot. If you take an idea to a Chinese executive, and I've done this, pardon my French, but they will say, fuck it, go for it. The Chinese apply this to manufacturing. They apply it to a lot of areas of life. And I'll give you one example, nuclear. Look what Germany has done with nuclear. The Germans say, why do we do nuclear? So they get rid of nuclear. The US, we're sort of figuring our footing out. We have 0 reactors, light water reactors under construction here in the US. So actually we're sort of hedging a little bit, like, I guess we should do nuclear, but like, let's show us the numbers. Meanwhile, China has 20 reactors that they're building in other countries. So China is building more reactors in other countries than the United States is building here. So I completely agree with the synthesis that it's attitudinal.
I think to stay on this China arc for a little longer. Here in the United States and in the West broadly, we're competing with massive amounts of state subsidies in industries of critical interest. And from the perspective of, say, venture capital, is venture capital by itself, and say even growth equity, private equity down the stack, is that sufficient in terms of spurring reindustrialization from a startup perspective? And what additional financial instruments do we need to compete with China there?
I'm going to take that. I mean, I think it really, like you said, it depends on the noun. I mean, really depends on the industry and the product and what we're talking about. There's a lot of stuff, like you said earlier, that I'm not convinced we need to make here, whether that's from a economic perspective, national security perspective. One of the things that I don't think a lot of people realize is like all of economics is really downstream of actually politics. The country decides what they prioritize, and there's all sorts of knobs that you can turn up and down. And one of the things we did for many decades is we, at the highest upstream point in the political world, decided that sort of geopolitical risk and all these things was basically written off as a zero. And so, when you talk about the decision was made to be a services economy, implicit in that is actually, well, there was a decision before that, which is like we made a decision that it actually doesn't cost you anything to not be able to make X, Y, Z. You go down the list, whether it's food, Germany, energy, us here, cars, exquisite or non-exquisite parts and systems. And in that is actually, explicitly an economic reality that's going to get spit out over certainly decades, if not a couple of years. One thing that, to the China point though, it's like, there's a lot of stuff that used to be really cheap to make there that's not cheap to make there anymore because they also are bound by the same physics of economics as we are. They have a giant growing middle class, which, if you're the CCP, it's probably not, something that you're really excited about because you can't be the cheap, export labor pool for the world anymore, which is part of why you see so much so much of the Belt and Road work. A lot of products and industries that used to be 20x cheaper to make in China are now only 20% cheaper to make in China, which goes to the point that you're talking about, which is like, well, now all of a sudden, whether it's political risk insurance or whether that's off takes, like all of a sudden now we're in a margin of error that like some industries with some government help, whether it's federal, state, or whether it's a societal change, capital markets, whether it's on the early risk side to JP Morgan announcing 1.2 trillion commitment. I don't know what that ultimately means, but I know Jamie really cares about it. All of a sudden, we are actually in driving distance of solving a lot of these problems and actually being able to produce stuff. But I'm really skeptical of it being like a state decided top-down thing. And it needs to be, again, in my mind, prioritized by high margin, high IP, high national security, stuff that we can actually scale. I don't know if we need to make plastic bottle caps in the US. We do actually do that because it's really, really cheap to make them. But that's where I kind of stand on that.
There's also like a little bit of a misunderstanding by folks in politics, folks in finance, around why manufacturing is valuable to be in the US, right? Oftentimes it's thought of as like, okay, that is the printer that makes the design, right? It's just a factory, it's a black box. Design comes in, product comes out, and I can sell that. So who cares where that thing is? But what people don't take into account is the fact that when you are in a manufacturing facility, it itself lends itself to innovation, right? When you have a manufacturing facility.
Experience curve.
Yes, exactly. When you end up having a manufacturing facility as not just a printer of products, but a place in which people experiment, come up with new ideas, and realize that a manufacturing facility is a set of constraints that can inform design, you end up forgetting why you are building something in the first place, right? The whole point of designing a product, right? It's funny, if you look at the back of an iPhone, right? Made in China, designed in Cupertino. You forget what is the point of the thing we are designing in the first place. It's a product, right? We are trying to build a physical thing. And in manufacturing facilities all over the US, and now all over China, people are innovating aggressively because they are finding, how does the metal actually bend? What are the actual real-world constraints that can inform my design, right? And because we are doing that less and less here, we are not innovating as aggressively as we can be on the design. And if we start framing it in that capacity, that's something that's really interesting to folks, right? That's why at a company like SpaceX, they're able to aggressively innovate because their engineers and their manufacturing team are not 100% unified, but sit really, really close together. It is a core component of the Elon perspective on building, right? There's an explicit statement made by the guy, manufacturing is 1,000 times harder than design. Design's the easy part. Making the thing in the real world with real world constraints, that's the hard part. And so if you think about the manufacturing facility as a learning bed for innovation, it's a reframing that I think we should be aggressively pushing, especially as we push for reindustrialization, right? If you can, the name of the game for production is speed, right? Speed, speed, speed. If we are looking at automotive in the US versus China, it takes us from design all the way to car rolling off the line 3 years. And so automotive execs in the US are terrified because they see 3 years for their time frames. And do you know what the time frame is in China? It's 1 year, right? And so if you think about increasing speed, it's not just speed in terms of how fast we can get a product to market, it's speed and reconfigurability of your factory. How fast can you adapt to change, right? That's agility. And our factories don't have agility. Chinese factories do. They actually are very good at reconfiguring their facilities. Because what they've realized is if you increase the rate of iteration and you can move faster more quickly, you can increase the pace of innovation. And that's something that we need to bake into our core when we think about reindustrializing and why it matters.
I just want to say one last thing on this, which is you can't download an industrial base. You can't clone the Git repository for the skilled labor that goes into this stuff. I use this anecdote all the time, and I realize I'm in the presence of 15-year SpaceX investors, so I hope I'm actually correct. But I've been saying for a long time that part of the reason SpaceX is able to do what they did is because there's no way around this. You can do some simulation, but the ability to get that much payload up to space is because they had to build a shitload of rockets and crash a bunch of them. Mm-hmm. And you just can't get around this. And that analogy is for anything in the physical world. And so as you develop and you get more efficient, you're able to make more stuff. Unfortunately, if you're not actually riding that experience curve, which makes things cheaper, it also develops a workforce. The problem is, if you're the ones who are just buying all this stuff, you're not developing that workforce and you're not developing that knowledge. And the flip side of this is because we're a knowledge economy and we develop all this amazing stuff, AI, China's able to literally clone that Git repository, by definition. So if all you do is innovate in the world of in bits, you're going to be at the bleeding edge in the forefront, but it's trivially easy for people to catch up. By definition, you download the freaking code. You can't download the code for how to make, how to get an automotive factory off the ground faster. You can't download the code for, overnight for how to make, how to do what SpaceX does. And you definitely can't download the code overnight to the hundreds of thousands of people's brains that need to know how to actually make the stuff. Yeah, so that's the real rate limit.
Just to add to that, if from a defense context, our few asymmetric warfighting capabilities, pretty much most of them were invented in the Cold War, right? Admiral Rickover and the nuclear submarine being one example. Modern day example, your best one's going to be SpaceX, and that's basically it. So at that point, where are asymmetric capabilities that other people can't catch up to on these super hard problems? And it's Admiral Rickover, a Polish immigrant Jew in the Cold War, invented this a long time ago, and then SpaceX is your most recent example, where no one's even close to a competitive Falcon 9 partially reusable rocket, let alone fully reusable. So yeah, that's a great example.
I want to get back to that point that you made about how we don't necessarily need to build bottle caps in the U.S. Apparently we do, and it's pretty cheap. But I think the bottle cap is a good example of just, say, a good that's not specifically mission critical. And I think we can all agree that, say, our defense industrial base, our rockets, our munitions should be manufactured here in the United States. But where do other allied nations or countries that are, say, more aligned on a global perspective with us, the West, say, than China, where do they fit into this reindustrialization and the supply chain broadly in your ideal world?
Well, in reality, a lot of folks who are trying to reshore are ending up nearshoring to Mexico very frequently. That's just one example. A lot of automotive facilities, a lot of tier 1, tier 2 suppliers moving their production from, let's say, China or India to Mexico. It's close enough. Labor is relatively cheaper, and they have capacity.
You guys got the European connect. I will say we need export markets at the end of the day. You can't, but you take it.
So, maybe we run Europe. Let's just use Europe as an example. And I hate to go back to Germany again because you could probably pick a couple other European countries, but they were very wrong on their energy policy. To think that they could rely on even their neighbors. Russia being perhaps one of them, but even France puts 20% of its nuclear, or southern Germany powers 20% of its power through French nuclear. So my own view is that we've gotten beyond strategic the typical argument in macroeconomics is, okay, protect your strategic industries and free trade everything else. But because of because of how broad-based supply chains are, and frankly, how many different parts and inputs there are to some important machinery, it's sort of hard to pinpoint exactly what's strategic and what's not. I mean, remember during COVID, there was like some part that was super small in cars, and you couldn't get a car for a while. What part was that? But it was.
It's. I mean, the notion you're talking about is that every capacity is a capability.
Yeah, it's like, so then where do you draw the line? I mean, sure, energy is obvious, but once you get down to it, it's very hard to have a broad-based economic principle.
Yeah, no, I mean, that is just highlighting the magnitude of the problem. Like, it's great that there's industrial policy now for rare earth elements and minerals, for energetics, for energy, really needed. Encouraging everyone here, like, we're still not even close. Thank God that we're prioritizing something now, but like, this is going to take another decade because there are literally like N of one sort of components or even electronics, like, which all predominantly come from China. So like, yes, maybe your drone motor or your battery one day will actually be domestically made and non-China reliant, but all the electronics is not being made here. And the problem with those ones, those are much harder on this point, is there's not a market, right? So like, the government can subsidize the beginnings of a market, and if it's large enough, the private markets will follow, the capital markets will follow, which is like the MP Materials deal is a great example. And I encourage everyone to like look at some of the industrial policy the administration is doing on rare earth elements and minerals and refining. Like, great. That does not exist for a electronics component that has a very, very small TAM, but is critical to, like, A, B, and C systems, and particularly that's dominated in China. So I think that is harder. Where allies can help is, where is their capacity? I mean, this is literally repeating exactly what China did to Germany. Like, where is their capacity and knowledge? Where can we invest to scale that up? And then where can we learn and bring some of that here to our country? And so I think you should see more of that in countries like Japan, South Korea, and Europe that do have manufacturing knowledge and capabilities that we do not have here. And we should invest and see them invest more in scaling that, and they can repatriate a lot of that demand from China to themselves domestically. But this is a huge growing opportunity. So at the same time, while that grows and that demand will be there, we can obviously then do the build out and build our own. The mistake you don't want to do is like what Germany's doing with their Constellation. What you don't want to do is, I will not buy from anyone and I'll invest in my own and I'll go with nothing for 10 years. That's insane. Like, we should rely on allies while we invest in our own.
Yeah.
There's the specific problem that you were talking about with the electronics, like low TAM, you might have like an IMU that has a TAM of like maybe 10 million, right? When you think about the actual fundamental underlying problem there, it's that high mix, low volume production is like not economically like solid, right? And so if we were thinking about how could we figure out, whether through technology or unique capital structures, how to make high mix, low volume production more automated and drive the cost to do very, very complex, potentially very high mix systems, very cheap, that will be the massive unlock that we would need, right? So again, I'm not a capital markets guy, but I'm sure there's a couple of different companies I'm seeing coming out who have interesting perspectives about maybe the core thing that they're making is not super, super high TAM, but they're aggregating a bunch of different capabilities whose net actually is a high TAM opportunity.
Yeah. To close us off, I think the final question I want to ask is specifically how we measure success in reindustrialization. And I think nearshoring is an interesting example because, a car plant brought to Mexico from China is not specifically reindustrializing the United States. But, I think from an American perspective, you can argue it's a net gain, right? The supply chain is closer. It's with a, relatively more allied nation. Extrapolating from that, how do we measure success in reindustrialization?
I think it's just going to be commercial champions. Like, the U.S. wasn't, from a national security standpoint, it's not like we thought about, let's become the industrial hub of the world so we're ready for World War II, right? That's very difficult to do. Instead, what happened is we just had the largest commercial market, right? Like, we were the dominant provider to the world commercially. And then some of that capacity was very easily repurposed. So I would say, like, what you would want to see is whether it's the traditional industries like auto, or obviously you see in aerospace, but in other areas, and particularly driven by products, like, we're the dominant player. And we're seeing that in data centers, like where we know how to do this, right? And so and that increase in demand globally is coming here and it's being built out here. I think you just want to see more of that. So like, what are we very good at commercially and we're the global champion in? That has to do with actually building hard things. The more of that happens here commercially, the more capacity that you'll get built out. And like, that's a measurement for success. And you end up de facto solving the national security problem. Like today, if we were in a conflict, I can guarantee you that Tesla Defense, that business line, which probably gets started, is going to solve a lot more problems than the myriad of startups that venture capital have funded, because they have scale commercially and they've built knowledge, even though they do not do any of this right now, right? So that's actually the better bet. Is like, there should be more Teslas across different industries.
True.
Personally, don't think you can measure it, but you'll know it when you see it.
Yeah.
And it probably will look like products. It'll probably look like something of the magnitude of cars. And my view actually is it could be nuclear microreactors will be the first product that you'll really see the fully reindustrialized supply chain.
If you're trying to measure success, if you look at the United States as a system, right? Let's say cut off all ties externally and other dependencies, right? We just say one day, nope, we're not importing anything from China for our supply chain period. And if you're setting up some measurements, the core measurement is speed, right? I am somebody in a manufacturing facility and I click order. I want some sort of subassembly. I want some sort of part. How fast does that get to my door? That is the measurement by how aggressively we've reindustrialized, right? That is like we can think about all the underlying economics of that. That is the core thing. How fast can either somebody in my facility or somebody down the block or somebody a state away get something that I want to me? Now, if you look at Amazon, right? Amazon has incredible efficiencies of metrics like that, but we don't think about we don't have a Amazon Basics for our tier 1 through 3 supplier base. And if we did, MasterCard is the closest thing to this, right? They can get some various nuts and bolts to your door next day. But we don't have that for things like pumps and valves and heat exchangers and everything that goes into everything that you see driving down the road or flying in the sky. So I think once we actually see those systems get shipped and on the doorstep of factories in 1 to 3 days, I think that's when we actually see success in reindustrialization.
I think it's a mix of all of these.
Yeah.
I think, look,
excellent.
One, I do think if this gets done, it's going to result in actually seeing a tip up on the productivity curve after decades of kind of flatlined. I think it kind of has to. I don't know how to do that, but I'm saying if this gets done, that's going to be something one of the downstream effects. I think you're going to see more massively publicly traded companies that are actually producing things. And actually, if you think about it, you look at some of the most valuable companies in the world. We don't think about companies like NVIDIA, but it's a company that so much of their value is because they actually make physical stuff. They're not a services business. And Tesla, and soon to be SpaceX as well. The other one thing I will say is I'm not convinced that it's a massive jobs program. And it's being from the Rust Belt, I wish I could say that it was, but I also know that you look at unemployment over the last. It's not like we have 20% unemployment. It's unclear how we're going to absorb an unbelievable number of jobs. I think automation and AI will give Americans superpowers. I think it's actually going to lead to net job creation. This is basically based on every single technological innovation in the past. It always leads to net innovation. The innovation leads to net job creation. You have the removal of some jobs, like the guy who's operating a horse and buggy, but then you have 20x the number of New York City cab drivers. That said, I do think we have to figure out the automation bit, and so I think what's it ultimately going to look like is going to be more publicly traded companies at scale making a ton of stuff, more productivity gains, and I think it's going to lead to you're actually going to see a bump up in American manufacturing jobs. I just don't think it's going to be the kind of metric where you're like, oh my God, we have 10 million more manufacturing jobs or anything like that.
So to this point, right, on the American manufacturing jobs question, we have 2 million plus open manufacturing jobs in the US today. We are running a skeleton crew. And so there's somewhat of a narrative out there that oh no, automation is going to take jobs, it's going to replace people. When you have a new tool enter a manufacturing facility nowadays, especially a tool like ours, when you talk to those folks and you ask, okay, cool, now that I can give you a superpowered tool So one person can do the work of 10. Are you going to fire 9 people now? It's like, no, now that I can do the work of 10 people, or that person can do the work of 10 people, we don't have to shut our facility down because 9 people just retired. That's the real problem we're actually facing. It's that over the next 5 to 10 years, a massive chunk of people who know how to build things are retiring and taking all of that tribal knowledge and context with them. Now, we are aggressively trying to stop that from happening, but that is the real problem. And so, we're China can just throw bodies at the problem, right? We can't really do that. And so we don't need cheap labor, we need smart labor. That is why automation and better tooling is the game changer for a lot of different problems within the reindustrialize effort.
Thank you so much. Well said, brother.